You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey y'all, spooky season is here. And if you're looking for a show to whet your appetite for a little haunted history, then I'd like to invite you to check out Southern Gothic, a chart-topping history podcast that explores some of the most infamous legends, folklore, ghost stories, and hauntings of the American South. We've covered all sorts of stuff from the Bell Witch of Tennessee to the disappearance of the Confederate submarine, the H.L. Hunley, not to mention our deep dives into the local lore of some of America's oldest and most haunted cities, like New Orleans, Charleston, and St. Augustine. So, if you're ready for a little good old-fashioned Halloween storytelling with a commitment to quality historical research, then be sure to check out Southern Gothic today. It's available now on all your favorite podcast apps.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 130 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast. When we left off last time, it was March 1862, and Major General George B. McClellan was finally launching the Army of the Potomac on a major campaign against the enemy. And Little Mac was quite literally launching his army, since he was shipping more than 100,000 men on transports down the Chesapeake Bay to Fort Monroe on the tip of the Peninsula in eastern Virginia, between the York and James rivers.
In many people's minds, it was about time McClellan got moving. He had been brought to Washington the previous summer, in July of 1861, immediately after the Union disaster at Manassas, to take command of the defeated, demoralized, disorderly force in and around Washington. McClellan plunged into the job with energy and boundless self-confidence, and, to his credit, showing formidable organizational skills, he would create a large, magnificent army, the Army of the Potomac. In fact, by September, Little Mac had, in effect, created a brand new army. Gone were the green, 3-month militiamen who had met with disaster at Bull Run. In their place were fresh recruits who had signed up for 3 years.
While the troops were set to drilling 6 to 8 hours a day, McClellan rode around their encampments on tours of inspection, building a strong bond with his army so that the men greeted him with wild enthusiasm whenever he appeared in their midst. He instilled discipline, improved morale, taught them how to march and maneuver. Little Mac made the blue-clad volunteers believe they were real soldiers, and the men loved him for it. The soldiers of the Army of the Potomac were confident now that they could whip the rebels any time, any place, and the troops were equally certain McClellan was, as a Massachusetts private wrote home, quote, just the man to lead us on to victory.
But if the troops adored Little Mac, some of his glitter began to fade in the eyes of the people outside the army. By mid-autumn, he had transformed the Army of the Potomac into the largest, best-trained, and best-equipped force ever seen in America, but he did not use it to move against the Confederate Army just a stone's throw away in Northern Virginia, and grumbling was heard in Congress, the press, and elsewhere over this lack of action. That fall, week after week, the weather was fine, the roads were dry, but McClellan steadfastly refused to attack the Confederates, or even deign to say when he might take the offensive. His hesitancy had several sources, not least of which was his firm belief that the fate of the nation was in his hands, and with that enormous responsibility always in mind, he became overly sensitive to the consequences of making a mistake or suffering a major defeat. This awareness only reinforced McClellan's innate caution. In addition, he displayed a remarkable tendency to overinflate enemy numbers. When the faulty intelligence fed to him by Allen Pinkerton confirmed his own suspicions of vastly superior enemy strength, Little Mac didn't hesitate to claim that he was facing 150,000 Confederates, when in reality the rebel army encamped around the old Bull Run battlefield totaled at most 42,000 men.
McClellan did, however, order one small offensive action in the fall of 1861, in October, at a place called Ball's Bluff. The result was a bloody and mortifying catastrophe that vindicated, at least in Little Mac's mind, his arguments against risking the Army of the Potomac in a major campaign. But while McClellan had so far refused to risk his army in a major action against the Confederates, he had been much more active in maneuvering to push aside Winfield Scott, the country's aged general-in-chief, and gain that post for himself. After Ball's Bluff, Little Mac not only managed to sidestep any responsibility for the defeat, but within a week of the disaster, Abraham Lincoln had accepted Scott's offer of retirement, and the president named McClellan as the new general-in-chief of all federal armies.
But though he had gained the post he had been coveting, McClellan still refused to use the Army of the Potomac to attack the Confederates. Then the coming of winter and Little Mac's coming down with typhoid fever seemed to make the argument moot, as the weather and the commanding general's sickness seemed to preclude any movement by the Army of the Potomac. But complaints over the Army's inaction only escalated. The political pressure on the president increased. In December, the radical Republicans in Congress crafted a new instrument that they would use to exert pressure on Lincoln and try to influence how the war was being run, the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. The Joint Committee wanted the president to take a less conciliatory approach to the restoration of the Union. They wanted the war to result in emancipation and in the breaking of the hated Southern slave power. And they wanted the West Point generals, especially the ones who were Democrats, to know that any failure, or perceived failure, to conduct operations in the field with the utmost vigor would result in the wrath of the committee descending upon them. To make their point, the committee vented its fury on the unfortunate General Stone after the debacle at Ball's Bluff and sent him to prison for 6 months.
The fate of General Stone was clearly meant to send a message to George McClellan, and Little Mac received that message loud and clear. He now considered the radical Republicans in Congress and their ally, the new Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, just as much his enemy as the Confederates. Knowing that any defeat the Army of the Potomac suffered would only provide ammunition to his enemies in Washington, McClellan became even more determined not to risk his army in battle until he could be absolutely certain of victory.
Abraham Lincoln did his best to defend McClellan, but as we said a moment ago, political pressure on the president was also steadily increasing. And of course, Lincoln's own frustration over Little Mac's failure to act was also growing. After the president took steps to prod McClellan into action, Little Mac finally revealed a plan, avoiding a direct assault on the rebels encamped around Centerville and Manassas, and instead calling for an elaborate end run around the enemy and a march on Richmond. This was McClellan's Urbana plan. Before that operation got going, however, word came that the Confederates were on the move. Joseph E. Johnston, the rebel commander, was, in his own way, just as cautious as McClellan, and Johnston had decided that his outnumbered force was dangerously vulnerable in its present position. So he pulled his army back about 60 miles to the south, to the Rappahannock River. This preemptive retrograde movement by Johnston ruined McClellan's Urbana plan, so Little Mac now proposed an alternative scheme. He would still make an end run around the enemy's army, but this move would be still larger and more elaborate, taking the Army of the Potomac farther down Chesapeake Bay to Fort Monroe at the tip of the peninsula, from which point an irresistible march would be made on Richmond, about 70 miles away.
At Alexandria, across the Potomac River from Washington, an assortment of vessels of all sorts had already been assembled for the aborted Urbana operation. 113 steamships, 188 schooners, 88 barges, and many other craft. Now that vast flotilla would be used for what would come to be called the Peninsula Campaign. On March 17th, the first units of the Army of the Potomac began to file aboard the ships for the 200-mile voyage south. And then on April 2nd, more than 8 months after he had been given command of the army, McClellan himself boarded ship, starting his grand campaign at last. He told Secretary of War Stanton, quote, "Rely upon it that I will carry this thing through handsomely."
History never says goodbye. It just says, see you later. Edward Galeano was right when he said that. Events keep happening over and over again in some form. And that's the reason I produced the podcast, My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. What is it? We take stories of history and apply them to the events of today to help you, perhaps, understand them better. We are also part of Airwave Media Network. I've been doing the program since 2006. That's a long time, and the show has a long name. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. Find me wherever you get podcasts.
What's something you learned in history class that you feel wasn't the whole truth? Better yet, what's something you didn't learn at all that was omitted completely? That's what I'd like to call redacted history. I believe that all history, no matter how good or bad, needs to be told. There are wars, massacres, battles, and entire historical events that are just not in our school's history books. Have you ever heard of Mary Bowser? I didn't think so. My name is Andre White, the host of the Redacted History Podcast, the place where history's forgotten events, heroes, and villains get their story told, one episode at a time. So come huddle around the campfire with me and get ready to hear the stories that you were robbed of. And get comfortable. We're going to be here a while. The Redacted History Podcast. Real history never dies. Stream the Redacted History Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
George McClellan always spoke of the Army of the Potomac as, quote, my army. It belonged to him, he once said, quote, as much as any army ever belonged to the man that created it. McClellan took special care to nurture the remarkable connection he had with the soldiers of his army. In his headquarters baggage, there was a portable printing press which was used to distribute grand Napoleonic communications to the troops. Before embarking on the Peninsula Campaign, Little Mac sent out one such address to the army. He explained to the men how, quote, I have held you back, that you might give the death blow to the rebellion that has distracted our once happy country. But the moment for action has arrived, and I know that I can trust you to save our country. I will bring you now face to face with the rebels, where I know you wish to be, on the decisive battlefield.
McClellan promised to watch over the soldiers of his army, quote, as a parent over his children, and you know that your general loves you from the depths of his heart. It shall be my care, as it has ever been, to gain success with the least possible loss.
For his closing, Little Mac adapted a passage from one of Napoleon's messages to his troops. After telling the men that during the coming campaign he would demand of them great, heroic exertions, rapid and long marches, privations, and desperate combats, McClellan said, quote, we will share all these together, and when this sad war is over, we will all return to our homes, and feel that we can ask no higher honor than the proud consciousness that we belonged to the Army of the Potomac.
George McClellan could talk the talk. Now it was time for him to prove he could walk the walk, and he started off his long-awaited campaign with what one British observer called, quote, the stride of a giant, end quote. Beginning on March 17th and then over the course of the next 3 weeks, the nearly 400 vessels in the Federal flotilla shuttled back and forth along the 200-mile route to Fort Monroe. The The fleet transported over 120,000 men, almost 15,000 animals, 1,200 wagons and ambulances, and 44 batteries of artillery, along with engineering materials, miles of telegraph wire, and everything else needed to sustain an army. The troops were happy to be free of their winter quarters and on the move, and McClellan was delighted to have his grand venture finally underway.
We've talked previously on the podcast about Fort Monroe and the Peninsula, back in episode number 50 about the Battle of Big Bethel, and about Benjamin Butler's decision to declare runaway slaves to be contraband of war. But if you look at your handy Civil War atlas, you can see where the peninsula is in eastern Virginia. You see Fort Monroe down at the tip of the peninsula, and you see that finger of land is flanked by the easily navigable James River to the south and York River to the north. Access to the James, however, was denied to McClellan thanks to the continued threatening presence of the Confederate ironclad CSS Virginia. On March 7th, the Virginia had steamed out of Norfolk and out into Hampton Roads, where it wreaked havoc among the Federal blockading fleet. The next day, though, the Union ironclad USS Monitor arrived and fought the Virginia to a draw. But the threat that the Virginia would make another sortie was enough for the Navy to inform McClellan that they couldn't protect the James River flank of the peninsula as long as the rebel ironclad was still lurking nearby.
As y'all recall from episode number 108 and our discussion of the battle between the two ironclads, Norfolk would later fall to Union forces and the Virginia would be scuttled. But by that time, McClellan had already committed his army and his supply line to the York River on the north side of the peninsula. The opening phase of McClellan's plan, once the Army of the Potomac had disembarked at Fort Monroe, was to push quickly up the peninsula and make his base at West Point, at the head of the York River, and a stop on the Richmond and York Railroad. Looking at his maps, Little Mac could see that the first obstacle his advance would face would be at Yorktown, about 15 miles up the peninsula from Fort Monroe. And yes, this is the Yorktown of Revolutionary War fame.
Since the beginning of the Civil War, Fort Monroe had been a thorn in the side of the Confederates. To contain the Federal presence at the tip of the peninsula, there were 12,000 rebel troops under the command of Major General John B. Magruder. Magruder was a native Virginian, and he was known as Prince John because of his fondness for amateur theatricals and fancy parties and his affinity for living in a higher style than his pay allowed. We talked about Magruder back in that episode on the Battle of Big Bethel, and in the spring of 1862, he is still here on the peninsula, commanding the 1,200 Confederates who covered a defensive line a dozen miles long, stretching from Yorktown south to the James River. In fact, that defensive line had been established by Robert E. Lee back in May of 1861, when Lee was commander of Virginia State Forces, before those forces were incorporated into the Confederacy. The line stretched across mainly flat land, but it was heavily forested with thick undergrowth, and there were numerous creeks, swamps, and marshes. And Magruder had taken advantage of the terrain by damming up some creeks and part of the Warwick River, thereby flooding most of the fordable sections of the river. Magruder had made certain that any potential crossing points were covered by rebel batteries and infantry.
McClellan began the advance up the peninsula with 2 columns on April 4th, after 60,000 of his 100,000 men had landed. The 3rd Corps, under Brigadier General Samuel Heintzelman, headed directly for Yorktown, while the 4th Corps, commanded by Brigadier General Erasmus Keyes, veered left on a route that would flank the rebels at Yorktown. Little Mac's intelligence on the size of Magruder's force was quite accurate, perhaps the only time in the ensuing 3 months that McClellan's assessment of enemy numbers would be accurate. McClellan expected to face 15,000 rebel troops near Yorktown, and he decided that a quick approach would knock this enemy force aside and open up the way to West Point.
But hardly a day into their march, the Federals discovered that their maps were faulty. The maps failed to show the numerous streams and swamps that slowed progress. And although McClellan had been assured that the peninsula's roads were passable in all weather and conditions, he soon found the truth to be otherwise. The clouds opened up, and rain turned the sandy roads into quagmires that swallowed cannon and wagons up to their axles. Nevertheless, on the afternoon of April 5th, Heintzelman's column drew up in front of Yorktown and came under artillery and musket fire from the Confederate positions. Little Mac had anticipated this, and he was prepared to spar with the rebel defenders here, while his other column, led by Keyes, passed to the south and outflanked the enemy.
But Keyes' column had also been stopped in its tracks that afternoon by a natural obstacle, the Warwick River, that was not supposed to be there. According to the Federals' maps, the Warwick ran parallel to Keyes' march, but in reality it cut squarely across his path. And as we've already mentioned, Magruder had taken advantage of this terrain feature by building several dams that deepened and widened the river at key spots. Now it could be crossed only at the points that were well guarded by Confederate cannon and infantry.
Keyes discovered this when he was greeted by heavy fire from a redoubt covering Lee's Mill Dam. After a hasty reconnaissance of the enemy defenses, Keyes sent McClellan a warning that, quote, "No part of the line so far discovered can be taken by assault without an enormous waste of human life." End quote. Keyes' gloomy assessment derailed McClellan's quest for a swift and decisive move against the rebels at Yorktown. After receiving Keyes' report, McClellan abandoned the hopes of making a quick strike on which his entire plan had rested, and decided instead to conduct a siege against Yorktown.
Keyes' report influenced McClellan not to attack, as did more disheartening news that arrived by wire that evening. That message told Little Mac that the First Corps, commanded by Irvin McDowell, was being held back and would not be joining him on the peninsula as planned. In the next episode, we'll take a closer look at the decision by Lincoln and Stanton to withhold McDowell's force to cover Washington, but for now, suffice it to say that McClellan was infuriated by the decision. He wrote to his wife somewhat hysterically that it was, quote, "the most infamous thing that history has recorded," end quote, and he was certain it was a move by his political enemies in Washington to ruin his campaign. It was from this moment that McClellan began creating a self-justifying chain of excuses that blamed all of the failures of the campaign on the withholding of McDowell.
McClellan fabricated uses for McDowell that he hadn't contemplated until long after he learned that he would be without the First Corps. But the fact is that on the afternoon of April 5th, Little Mac didn't need McDowell's men to break through against an opponent he outnumbered 5-1. He had 58,000 men facing Yorktown and the Warwick River line, which were covered by an enemy force he himself estimated to number only about 15,000. Ever cautious, though, McClellan hesitated when confronted by a well-entrenched foe.
In Washington, Lincoln and Stanton were fully aware of McClellan's numerical superiority and the need for a quick march up the peninsula, and they were frustrated at the delay. The president fired off a telegram to Little Mac stating, quote, "I think you had better break the enemy's line from Yorktown to Warwick River at once," end quote. But McClellan could not be induced to move aggressively, and the longer he dithered, the more his situation seemed to deteriorate, since the rebels across the way appeared to be receiving massive reinforcements.
It was now that the Confederate commander, Prince John Magruder, came into his own. Magruder called upon his experience in amateur theatricals to produce his best show ever, which was a great deception featuring a cast of thousands. His bands played, his artillery roared, and all along the river line his men marched in giant circles, out of sight except when they paraded past certain spots, plainly in view of the Yankees. And for hours the Federals watched as rebel troops marched into sight, looking for all the world like an endless stream of reinforcements coming up to bolster the Confederate defenses.
And McClellan was completely taken in by the charade. On April 7th, he wrote, quote, "The Warwick River grows worse the more you look at it," end quote. He telegraphed Lincoln, quote, "It seems clear that I shall have the whole forces of the enemy on my hands. probably not less than 100,000 men, and possibly more.
In his reply, the president questioned McClellan's arithmetic and again, in vain, urged the general to attack. But Little Mac was now convinced that an assault would only result in the slaughter of his troops, so he decided instead to bring up his big siege guns and obliterate the Yorktown defenses from a safe distance. Siege warfare, with its methodical preparations and scientific procedures, appealed to the engineer in McClellan and to his cautious nature.
Intent on settling the matter with the siege, McClellan passed up the opportunity for a breakthrough on April 16th. That morning, a reconnaissance in force at a dam site called Burnt Chimneys near the middle of the Warwick River line resulted in some Vermont troops fording the river while others charged straight across the dam. They established a foothold on the opposite side. Had McClellan followed up their success with reinforcements to exploit the crack in the enemy's defensive line, he could have bypassed Yorktown and moved up the peninsula. But Little Mac refused to take advantage of the opportunity, and before long the Confederates counterattacked and pushed the Vermonters back across the river.
As McClellan methodically prepared for his big, earth-shaking bombardment of Yorktown, which was scheduled to start on May 5th, the Confederates had ample time to flood the peninsula with real reinforcements. Once McClellan's intentions became clear, elements of the main Confederate army started to move down from their position northwest of Richmond. And on April 17th, Joe Johnston himself arrived to take charge of the growing rebel force on the peninsula. 3 of his 5 divisions had already arrived on the scene, and the others were on their way.
By Saturday, May 3rd, nearly all of the massive Yankee siege guns were in place. There were 114 of them, in addition to the more than 300 pieces of field artillery accompanying the Army of the Potomac. Everything was ready for the great bombardment that would obliterate the rebels' defenses. But Johnston declined to cooperate. He knew that the weak Yorktown fortifications couldn't stand up to McClellan's big guns, so he decided to withdraw. On the night of May 3rd, after a covering bombardment of their own, the Confederates quietly slipped away and retreated up the peninsula toward Williamsburg, some 12 miles away.
When it was discovered that the enemy had slipped away, McClellan was delighted. He wired Washington the news, declaring, quote, "Our success is brilliant," end quote. Little Mac had won Yorktown as he had hoped, without a fight. But the month-long delay had also cost McClellan the opportunity to win his campaign with a rapid march up the peninsula to threaten Richmond. Little Mac had begun this end run, this grand movement to open up an entirely new front, with the stated intention of getting to Richmond ahead of Joe Johnston. But his caution and his decision to demolish the rebels' Yorktown position with his big siege guns had given the enemy the gift of time. And that meant that now there would be no easy victory. McClellan had undertaken this campaign because he said it would allow him to avoid the main strength of the enemy in northern Virginia. But the month-long delay in front of Yorktown had allowed Joe Johnston to shift his army down to the peninsula to oppose McClellan. So now Little Mac would have to face the very Confederate army he claimed to be trying to avoid by undertaking this campaign. Next time, as we said, we'll talk a bit more about Lincoln and Stanton's decision to withhold McDowell's corps from McClellan, and we'll also look at the fight that occurred at Williamsburg as the rebel army withdrew up the peninsula after abandoning Yorktown.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is The Peninsula Campaign of 1862, A Military Analysis, by Kevin Dougherty with J. Michael Moore.
As you might guess from the subtitle of this book, which proclaims it to be a military analysis, this is a reassessment of the Peninsula Campaign, paying special attention to the military principles involved, as it tells you not just what decisions were made, but why those decisions were made. It may sound kind of technical, but it's actually a smoothly written account, and it never seems tedious. So that's The Peninsula Campaign of 1862, A Military Analysis, by Kevin Dougherty with J. Michael Moore.
Don't forget you can find all of our book recommendations at the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
And we have a couple of new members of the Strawfoot Brigade to thank this week, Ryan and Ted.
Thanks, y'all. We wanted to mention that we've had a delay in getting the next Island Number 10 episode out due to some technical issues, but one way or another we hope to get that out to you in the next week.
Yep, it would help if we were more techie, or techier, but we aren't. Anyway, thanks for listening to this episode of The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, a history podcast. Tracy and I hope you'll join us again next week when we continue looking at McClellan's march up the peninsula. But until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.